listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, Mr. Trump's big, beautiful bill has passed in US Congress. So what does this mean and will it further cripple the already fragile American economy? All the details coming up. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Friday, the 4th of July. The Federal Education Minister Jason Clare says the Commonwealth will introduce new laws to protect children in response to those shocking allegations of child sexual abuse this week in Melbourne. A bill to be introduced in the coming weeks will allow federal childcare centre investigators to undertake spot checks and also unannounced visits.
This work will never end. There are always going to be more things that we need to do here because there's always going to be people who are going to try and break through the net to try to do the dastardly things that we've seen other people do.
The legislation will also allow the government to pull funding from centres who consistently fail to meet safety and quality standards. The new promise from the government comes amid reports a worker from the same childcare facility in Melbourne at the centre of the shocking allegations had complained to authorities 3 years ago about a lack of proper supervision. There are concerns the luxury car involved in the horror crash that killed a famous Liverpool footballer and his brother had been at the centre of safety issues and recalls. 28-year-old Diogo Jota and his brother Andre were in the Lamborghini in Spain when one of the car's tyres suddenly blew out, causing it to veer off the road, crash and then burst into flames. And after weeks of speculation, it's been officially confirmed that Katy and Orlando Bloom have separated. Representatives for the former couple have released a statement confirming that Orlando and Katy, quote, have been shifting their relationship over the past many months to focus on co-parenting, adding they will continue to be seen together as a family as their shared priority is and always will be raising their daughter with love, stability and mutual respect. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill with Professor Brendon O'Connor, an expert in US politics and foreign relations from the University of Sydney. The controversial bill finally passed US Congress, with President Trump saying the major win now gives him even more power.
I think I have more power now, I do. I could say, I don't know. I think I probably do because we've had a great record of success. My first term was very, very successful. We had the greatest economy in the history of our country. I think we're going to blow it away this term.
The new bill adds trillions of dollars to the US's already crippling debt and sees major cuts to healthcare. Now, critics are saying this massive spending spree will only benefit the billionaires and hit the most vulnerable the hardest. Brendon, thanks so much for joining us. If you can explain to us what is, as President Trump calls this, the big, beautiful bill. What is it?
Well, partly it's a kind of preponderance of pages, 940 pages, and it's really serving different parts of the Republican Party. Donald Trump has promised to be a different type of Republican since he entered politics. But in a lot of what he did in his first term, particularly the most major bill through the Congress, it was pretty similar to this, that Republicans of the Congress have long argued for lower taxes, for less government spending on things like medical coverage, on less spending on food stamps for the poor, less on disabilities. So Trump has gone along with that both times. In his first term, there was a bill similar to this, and he's done that this time. The problem is if you decrease taxes, and you increase some of the areas that Trump wants money spent on, particularly these money to ICE, immigration and customs enforcement, that budget has gone up very significantly. The combination of some of the increased power that Trump wants through this huge piece of legislation and the reduction of income taxes, some of the taxes on estate taxes and the like, is going to lead to an increase in the US debt. And I suppose that's a controversy that we know because of the Trump-Musk sort of bust up. And that's been something that people have, even conservatives in the United States like Musk, who are thinking about their business bottom dollar, are going to be concerned about the long-term consequences, about the increase in federal debt likely from this act, and the sense that Trump and many of the Republicans really aren't thinking much about the future. They're thinking very short-term for those who've supported them in the business community or wealthy Americans, and they're not thinking about the US economy in 10 years, and they're not thinking very much about those blue-collar workers that probably rely on a bit of medical coverage, maybe a bit of government support here and there. Those people haven't been given much at all in this bill. So it's traditional Republican fare. Ronald Reagan did something like this in 1981. When he was president, he supported a similar congressional bill. Trump in his first term, very similar bill, and we have something similar to it again this time around in the first year of his second term.
Brendon, in regards to the numbers, the debt, they are mind-blowing. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated this bill, which will cut health and food safety, but also boost, as you mentioned before, his election promises of tax cuts and also his crackdown on immigration. It's estimated this would add around 3.4 trillion US dollars to the nation's $36.2 trillion debt. Those figures are mind-blowing.
Yeah, I mean, it's something the United States would have the capacity to get on top of, though. I mean, such a huge economy. If you think of the annual spend on defense in the United States, about $1 trillion per year. So with a sort of program, I mean, I suppose this is what Doge was trying to argue for, although it was incredibly kind of haphazard and, creating many own goals, I think, into the future, cutting some of the foreign services, foreign aid that the United States has cut. But there is, particularly in the US military, there's probably a lot of, over expenditure that you could have got into. There's an argument that there is some government waste, but this bill really isn't concerned about that. It's largely concerned about programs for the very poor in America and giving greater tax income for the very wealthy. And that's, as I said before, that was kind of classic Reaganomics. Reagan did that in 81 and 82 with his Congress that he had significant control over. Trump did this in 2017. We've seen this playbook before, and all of those things added massively to US debt. Those three bills have been two of the greatest causes, the past two bills, on debt, because the combination of tax cuts and not really cutting the big expenditure items like Social Security, military spending, those things don't really get that much that touched. It's these very marginal programs which are unpopular with some Republicans, but they don't add up to a great deal of money, spending a few million on money for the homeless to eat. But, those programs will be cut in this bill.
The bill only passed, when you look at the breakdown of it, 218 votes to 214. President Trump says this is a major victory that will enable him to have more power. Do you think that closer vote is actually a victory for President Trump?
I think the more significant vote is in the Senate. So it was 50-50 in the Senate and requires the Vice President, J.D. Vance, to cast the decisive vote. 3 senators, Tillis, Susan Collins from Maine, and Rand Paul from Tennessee all voted against it. Their political life is going to be pretty difficult. Collins will be, as a Republican, and she'll be primaried. I think Tillis has said he's going to leave politics after the next election, so he's not up for re-election. So this is loyalty, but it's not entirely all about Trump, this bill. Many of these Republicans who've put this through, they've been dreaming of many of these things for the entire Biden presidency. Trump is not a master of detail. To think that he's on top of 940 pages is to be, I think, very optimistic about his interest in reading. Many of these things are pet projects of people in the Congress. And that's in some ways where Trump he's outsmarted by some of these Congress people. They want to set the agenda. They're happy to send him out to speak, for him to be the front man. But in some ways, the most important things of his first term were these big tax cuts that were able to get through the Congress, through this guy, Paul Ryan, who was the Speaker of the House. And once again, I think you've got to see this as, a lot of this is standard Republican kind of dreams in many regards. And they've got a president that they can kind of direct in certain ways to, promote the case.
Brendan, you spoke there about the former US President Joe Biden. Of course, he's going to disagree with what President Trump is doing, but he's put on his social media today, and I'm quoting the former US President Joe Biden here, saying, "This Republican budget bill is not only reckless, it's cruel," saying that it closes rural hospitals and cuts food assistance for our veterans and seniors, and it also jacks up energy bills. And all of this to give a massive tax break to billionaires. Working people deserve better. Do you think he makes any valid points there?
Yes. I think this will be one of the true tests of the Trump coalition with the sort of Republicans in the Congress is, will there be a kind of, downturn to the economy because of tariffs, inflation going up, people who maybe, there's a lot of people in the United States who have a good reason to be very disillusioned with both parties because they've lost jobs. The economy is often pretty unstable for those at the bottom of the economic rung in America. And if those people, they don't usually vote in midterm elections, but if they come out in the presidential election next time round and say, well, Biden wasn't much chop, Trump didn't deliver, he made all these promises, life is even worse than it was under Biden, then I think the Democrats will be kind of turning back to someone like a Bernie Sanders. Not Sanders will be well into his 80s, so he's not going to run, but a younger generation of people who want to do things pretty differently. So I think there actually is quite a lot at stake for the Republicans here. And you saw a bit of this in the New York mayoral race, which you can't really expand as across America. You're not going to have someone like Mandani as a presidential candidate. But it did speak to that politics of just talking about people's hip pocket, cost of living. And I don't see how Trump's going to do much to make that better. And this bill, I don't think, will make that better. So I think there'll be a lot of people pretty disillusioned again about American leaders after this. And the likely consequence, I think, greater inequality, greater sense at the bottom of American economic sort of society of people who are just frustrated and really don't always know who to blame.
And Brendan, finally, in regards to criticism, there's been some analogy in Australian media this afternoon, quoting celebrated historian Sir Niall Ferguson, saying this bill is what he would call Ferguson's Law, saying a rule of thumb under which, quote, any great power that spends more on debt servicing than on defence risks ceasing to be a great power. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't usually agree with Ferguson on much. He's one of the great defenders of the British Empire, has a great press. Yes. So he's a controversial figure. He's good at getting in the media. But I think he's largely right that you don't put your own house in order. You don't make any long-term planning about your financial sort of situation as an individual or as a country. Eventually, those sort of chickens will come home to roost. And I think with Trump, on the environment, on debt, on a number of other issues, he's not a long-term thinker. He's not interested in what he's going to do for the next generation of Americans. He's interested in himself, the here and now, the attention economy. And so for him, I don't think this is a great downside. He probably will be gone from politics in 4 years' time. But I think for the American economy as the wanting to be the dominant economy in the world, this isn't sensible thinking. You put the smartest economists in America together in a room and say to them, what do you need to do? And one of the things would be to address debt. I think that would be a consensus view. So there's very much politicians ignoring the experts and the people who have studied this deeply and saying this will be good for those who fund us, for those who we're close to, for those wealthy donors we are associated with the business community. And, that's a risk. That's a risk, as I said, Reagan got into in the early 80s with trickle-down economics, thinking, well, this will lead to a boom of the economy. Trump, I think, is a believer in that same way of seeing things with tariffs kind of in the mix. But even if it does lead to companies very happy about this, the American stock market likely to react very positively, there'll be a lot of people who are left behind. And I think that's where Joe Biden is right. There's a cruelty to this approach. And we know it from the past that the wealth gap, the inequality gap, the income gap widens when you have policies like this. And, we've got a lot of hard evidence on that.
We really appreciate your analysis. Thanks for joining us, Brendan.
My pleasure.
That was US political expert Professor Brendon O'Connor from the University of Sydney. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'll be back tomorrow with the weekend briefing. And on tomorrow's episode, Antoinette is joined by the founder of Heart on My Sleeve, Mitch Wallace.
As it relates specifically to trauma and the witnessing of a genocide and of a war, our brains are not designed to consume that much evil. You know, we are a very archaic hardware in a very modern software, and our bodies might be used to seeing momentary trauma on battlefields, but battlefields that are constantly surrounding us all day, every day on our phones has cataclysmic impacts to our mental health.
We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.